Podcasters. Podcasting Smarter is the official podcast from Podbean, featuring podcasting interviews, best practices, and helpful tips. We're here to give you the tools, resources, product updates, and news to help you get started podcasting and keep your podcast growing.
Hello, and welcome everyone. We are so excited that you're here with us today. We have a very special presentation and a very special guest. My name is Norma Jean Belenke. I am the head of events here at Podbean, and I am joined today by Mark Kaplan, who is the co-founder of the Dagoba Group. And he's going to be talking all about DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So really amazing presentation for you all here today. And at Podbean, it's super special to us because with our enterprise and business platform, Podbean Pro, a lot of enterprise level organizations, governmental organizations, Fortune 500, Fortune 100 organizations are using internal, secure, and encrypted podcasting to really utilize a lot of the knowledge that Mark and DEI professionals have and put it into action. So for us, we really wanted to bring Mark in to speak to everyone here today. And we're just so excited to have you here. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you so much, Norma Jean. We're really happy to be partnering with Podbean and having a chance to talk to everyone. So I'm really pleased to have this opportunity. Should I go right ahead in, Norma Jean?
I'm going to read our brief intro and then we'll jump right in. So we're so excited to have you here. And Mark has a whole presentation, so stay tuned. And also, if you have any questions, you're going to want to pop them here in the chat so that Mark and our team here at Podbean can make sure that we address your questions and that we still have the full presentation. So I'm going to read our intro and then I'm going to hand it off to Mark and then my face is going to disappear. It's been nice to be here with all of you. All right, well, here we go. Welcome back, everyone, to Corporate Podcasting Smarter and our February live event, Creating a Culture of Ownership, Achieving Your Inclusion Dividend with Mark Kaplan of the Dagoba Group. For those of you who may join us for the first time, Corporate Podcasting Smarter has live stream sessions like this one, along with exclusive recorded episodes on the Podcasting Smarter podcast. Corporate Podcasting Smarter and this series is brought to you by Podbean. We're a private podcast hosting solution for Fortune 100 companies with secure encrypted podcasting and a proven track record within the industry. Head over to podbean.com/enterprise to learn more about our business and enterprise solutions. And we've got that link here in the chat for you. And now we'll get started. Mark, I will hand it off to you. Hello and welcome.
Thank you so much, Norma Jean. Hi, everyone. This is a great opportunity. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to speak to you today about what we see as a path forward for DEI initiatives. If you think about where we started, at least in the US, when we started doing this work 50 years ago, and the focus was really more legal and compliance. Over time, we shifted and we started to think about, maybe we should talk about how to value differences. Maybe there's actually, this is kind of it's the right thing to do. There's a moral case to be more diverse, right? Then we focused a bit more on managing diversity. What does it actually mean to have a diverse team, and what do we have to do to make sure that that's effective? Eventually, we started to get grounded in the value, like the business case, if you will, for inclusion. And now I think our conversation is about how do we really embed inclusion in the way we operate as organizations. And in order to do that, there has to be a shared sense of ownership. So like if you think about any large scale change process in any organization that you've been affiliated with or any institution really, when you have buy-in and when you have a sense of ownership, then those changes become real. So let me say a little bit about the Dagoba Group quickly, and then we'll dive into the content. So just a little bit about us, and I want to intro us next. Yeah, there we go. So I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but I'll say a couple things. One is that we're a firm that is schooled in organizational change. So we tend to think about DEI in the context of how do you drive change in an organization. Our work is truly global. More than half of our work is done outside of the US. We've got a really diverse team of consultants. And we've been doing this for about 3 decades. So we've kind of seen the way that the field has evolved over time. All right, so next, let me just talk about the objectives, what we're going to cover today. we're obviously understanding the importance of inclusion is kind of the foundation for what we're talking about here. Now, what we've found is that folks understand much more today than they did 10 or 15 years ago about why inclusion is important. There's been a ton of research. We'll talk briefly about it. But you're going to have a sense of ownership for inclusion in your organization. Obviously, at the base of that is going to be a sense for why it's important, why it matters at all. Secondly, we'll talk about what is ownership. I've been throwing this word around so far. I've probably said it 10 times already in the podcast, right? So what do we mean by ownership? I'll give you an example, and we'll really narrow in on this concept of ownership and how it applies to inclusion. And then we'll look, as we get later in the presentation, to what are some of the barriers to creating ownership, and what are some of the pathways, the enablers to creating an ownership culture. So I'll try to get more and more specific as we get to the end, so you can think about things that you might want to do for yourself or within your organization or institution that you're working with today. Okay, so let's talk for a minute or two about the importance of inclusion. There's been a ton of research over the last really 10 to 20 years that have established the four things you see on this slide. That inclusion produces more engagement. If I say, I should probably say for a minute what inclusion really is. So if you think about diversity as any difference that makes a difference, any difference that matters, the things that are obvious, the things that might be less obvious, then inclusion is about the extent to which all of these diverse groups feel able to make their fullest contribution. So what we know about inclusion is that it creates more engagement, right? So more inclusion equals more employee engagement. A larger body of research also says that more employee engagement is correlated with more customer engagement. So you can sort of see the connection to an inclusive culture to what happens with customers. It's pretty clear. It's a pretty clear equation. A lot of research, particularly in the last 10 years, has shown that diverse teams that are led inclusively are more innovative and more creative. And this research is across different sectors, different industries, and different parts of the world. And so it's not enough just to have a diverse team, right? You have to also have an inclusive climate. And when you do that well, then what you get is inclusive and more innovation and creativity. Also, better decision-making. So the short version of this is essentially we simply use our brains more when we're a part of a diverse team, particularly a diverse team that is led inclusively. And because of that, we've got a broader picture, we push ourselves more, and we make better decisions. And lastly, better performance, which, of course, all of that I've said so far, it leads to better performance. So diverse teams that are led inclusively perform better than non-diverse teams. That's a pretty strong research finding over the last couple of decades. So think about this as kind of the basis for developing a culture of ownership, right? People have to understand and buy into the fact that, oh, this is actually a good thing, not just for groups that may have been traditionally excluded, but for the whole organization. And that's a foundational to ownership. So let's dig in a little bit more. Let me give you an example here. So imagine that we're all in an auditorium, right? I'm giving this talk and I ask for everyone in the audience to raise their hand if you think about data security just about every day, if not every day at work, right? And most people would raise their hands if I asked that question. And if I said to you, okay, now if data security is in your title, take down your hand. And almost every hand in the audience would go down, right? Because most people don't have data security. But yet there's a sense of ownership, isn't there? If they're thinking about data security, if you're thinking about data security every day, that means that it's in your mind regularly. That means that you're probably doing little things, you're having thoughts, and you've maybe even have some best practices or some little reminders to make sure that you're protecting the data that is, important to your organization, right? So not many people have data security in their title, yet everybody owns data security as an important thing, and it shows up in lots of little ways. Well, what we're suggesting with inclusion is that that's the path. That's where we need to get to. We need to have a sense of ownership for inclusion, because there's only going to be a few people in your organization, most likely, that have inclusion or diversity and inclusion or DEI in their job title, right? But if this is going to be something that gets embedded into organizations, then we're going to have to create this kind of ownership the same way we might see with data security or any other large change initiative. So hopefully that example helps begin to give you a flavor, but let me say a little bit more about this ownership mindset. so we can dig into it a bit. So we think that there are three components to creating an ownership mindset. So one is empowering bystanders to be owners, right? We all can relate to being a bystander, right? I mean, you sort of like you're seeing something happen, but you look at it and you're not sure whether you should do anything, and you figure, well, maybe that's someone else's responsibility. Like we all do that to some extent in some way in our lives. I have this memory of showing up, this was a couple of decades ago, at a large corporate headquarters of an energy client. And it was my first time in their corporate headquarters, and I had just traveled in, I'd flown in, so I had my bag with me, and I start to walk up the stairs, and my hands are kind of full because I have a briefcase in one hand and my luggage in the other hand, and I had not taken 3 steps before 2 people came over and said, "You have to hold on to the banister," and I was like, "Wow." Well, what was that? I've never had that experience before. What in this organization, they had embedded safety into their culture because it was so critical to everything they did. And they're an energy company. They're doing a lot of dangerous things. And so they needed to work hard to create a safety culture. And they needed for everybody to own it. And they knew that you can't just send people to a training program and say, oh, okay, that's great. We've trained you on safety, so it's all good. They had to do something they had to create a sense, I'd say this today, right? A sense of ownership for safety so that it showed up in people's behavior day to day, so that it was always on their mind. So what we want is as happened in the example that I described, is for us to not be bystanders. We're much more aware, I think, of diversity in general than we used to be. But what do we do with that awareness? We can watch a lot of things happen, but if we don't find moments to interrupt dynamics that aren't helpful or that are not inclusive, then the awareness doesn't really translate to anything, right? And when we're trying to create an ownership mindset, we need to move from being the sort of observer who has high level of awareness, right, to being someone who acts as an owner and interrupts dynamics that are not going to be helpful to the team or to the organization, to their colleagues, and eventually to themselves, really, in some way, directly or indirectly. So that's one component. Another component is that ability to interrupt and be interrupted, right? So we need to be able to effectively interrupt behaviors that are not inclusive. And I say effectively, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like later. We don't need to be a one-person wrecking crew running around taking people out at the knees if we think they've done something that's not inclusive. But on the other hand, we need to find ways to effectively interrupt behavior that's not helpful to the team, right? And in order to do that, we have to be able to be interrupted. We have to be interruptible if we're going to set a tone that says that, we should hold each other accountable for being inclusive, right? So we need to not be bystanders. We need to be owners. We need to be able to interrupt and be interrupted. And this will make more sense when I talk about it in just a minute. We also need to leverage our insider status. And what that really refers to is the fact that on most aspects of difference, if diversity is any difference, it makes a difference. There's almost always a sort of this component of insider or outsider. And that really reflects quite often the extent to which I even think about an issue or not, right? When I'm in the insider group on some aspect of diversity, I'm a man, for example. I don't have to think about gender in the same way perhaps that a woman might be thinking about gender. But if I'm going to own inclusion, then I'm going to need to both understand what it means to be a man, and I'm going to need to leverage that group identity, if you will, to benefit in the organization. I can't just leave that sitting for women to do. So let's look a little bit more at this insider-outsider concept here. Now, this is not intended to be a complete list, but it's intended to give you some examples you can relate to. These are some typical insider and outsider groups that you see in organizations. And when you look at this list, you might say to yourself, well, gee, I'm in the insider group on some issues. I'm on the outsider group on some other issues, right? And you may even notice when you look at this that, hey, when I'm in the insider group, I tend to not think about this. And when I'm in the outsider group, I might be actually very aware of these differences. And, when you're in the outsider group, you tend to bring kind of naturally a lot of energy to trying to create change because you see the barriers that you face that are sometimes big, but often subtle and small. And so you've got both awareness and energy that you bring to change. When you're in the insider group, you can be this really well-intended person, but you're not seeing the accumulation of all these little things. And so the awareness and energy that you bring to change is going to be less than the outsider group. And that's the dynamic that we have to get at. So when we're trying to create an ownership mindset, one of the key questions is how do we get the insider group on any given issue to own the need for change and to help drive that change in behavioral and specific ways. So let's talk a little bit more about what we mean by owning change, right? Using this insider and outsider group dynamic as a bit of a backdrop, right? So what you can see on the right side are all the things that the outsider groups can do that help drive change. Now, I always like to say, look, anyone can do anything, right? So you're not limited to, to these roles, whether you're in the insider group or the outsider group on any given issue. But you can see that these roles are ones that I think are particularly helpful. When you're in the outsider group, you're trying to drive change often through building relationships with other people, amplifying your voice, aligning with insiders who are invested, who are owning change and want to own change. When you're in the insider group, and we think this is the less leveraged aspect of change, right? So if we're trying to create an ownership culture, we really have to tap what insider groups can bring to the change process. And when you're in that insider group on any given aspect, again, you're going to be on the insider group on some issues and probably on the outsider group in others. So we're all in this dynamic on both sides at various times. But we need to raise our awareness. We need to be aware of our behavior. We need to start to think about this stuff and then realize this notion of allyship that some of you probably have heard of before. Well, what we think allyship is essentially, it's really about owning our insider status and acting on that, right? So we want to, when we're trying to act as an ally, we're going to be reaching out proactively to people in outsider groups. We're going to be noticing what's going on. We're going to have a sense of why this is important to us, why inclusion is important to us, why we need to interrupt non-inclusive behavior. And we're going to see how it's important that we do that when we're in the insider group and not rely on the outsider group to do all of that interrupting, because that's a traditional dynamic, right? And if you can imagine when you're in the outsider group, it gets tiring to interrupt all the time. So here's these three concepts. We've talked a bit about, or these three aspects of creating an ownership mindset. We've talked a bit about leveraging our insider status, and we've also talked about, and we're going to talk a little bit more about these other two aspects. How do we empower ourselves as bystanders to become owners? And how do we interrupt and be interruptible? So let's look specifically at what we mean by this bystander effect. So we can all be bystanders, right? And I'm certain we all have been bystanders in some way or another in our lives. And this is really us when we don't intervene in a situation that needs an interruption. And there could be lots of reasons for that. Some of the psychological research says it's sort of like there's a diffusion of responsibility, that it's somebody else's responsibility, or maybe social pressure not to interrupt a dynamic that is sort of seen as normal or typical, right? This whole bystander effect is enhanced by insider and outsider dynamics, as I was sort of getting into a bit on the last slide, that, when we're in the insider group, we tend to not notice when we're in the outside, and we sort of feel like, ooh, should we say something, right? We check with we kind of look at the outsider group often and say, well, they don't seem upset, so maybe we shouldn't do anything, right? So we're not really owning in this when we're a bystander. So if we can break this, if we can start to interrupt, and particularly when insiders start to do more of it, we slowly begin to change the norms, right? We slowly begin to change the climate of the team, and we take the onus off of the outsider to always have to be alone in trying to manage these dynamics. So we make it something that's an organizational norm. And that's where we're trying to drive with this notion of a culture of ownership. Let me show you a picture of what that can look like. And, think of a typical meeting where you've got someone is the most senior person in the room, and you have some colleagues, and then you have, in any given scenario, impacted outsider groups, right? And it's like, okay, somebody does or says something that's maybe not so inclusive. Who's supposed to intervene here? Who's supposed to interrupt? I mean, we tend to think, well, maybe the most senior person in the room should do that. Well, sure, right? In an ideal world, people would use their positional authority to make sure that we have a good working climate. But guess what? Senior people are people too. And in some cases, the more senior you are, the less you sort of see some of these day-to-day dynamics. So there we have some colleagues. Maybe this is a couple of white colleagues, and then we've got maybe a couple of colleagues of color, impacted outsider group. Maybe the folk, maybe what's happened is that something non-inclusive from a racial perspective has happened. What happens here? What should happen here? Do we leave it with the impacted outsider group to say something if they feel they can, to sort of have to deal with the risk of how they'll be perceived if they name a dynamic, right? It's not always easy to tell people when you feel like you're being treated unfairly or non-inclusively. There's a level of risk that goes along with that. Maybe it's a little bit better if the colleagues who are not persons of color are able to casually and easily interrupt that non-inclusive behavior. That sort of level sets the dynamic on the team. It makes it much easier to deal with any issue, right? If we're talking about race, but then we could talk about gender, we could talk about gender identity, we could talk about a number of issues. The more we're effective on some issues, the more effective we're going to be on other issues in terms of creating an inclusive environment. In order to do that, we have to have this ownership mindset, and we have to get insiders starting to not be bystanders. Next, I want to look a little bit into what we mean by interrupting, right? Because I said earlier that, if you don't want to be a bystander, then there's really two things that are essential. One is that you have to interrupt, but you also have to be interruptible, right? So you want to focus big picture on creating a tone with some ground rules where people feel like they can give each other honest feedback about any kind of team dynamics that are relevant, right? You want to have some ability to look at patterns that you see on the team. Maybe you notice that in a conversation, the women are often being interrupted when they start to put out an idea. Or maybe you notice that you've got a global meeting with people from different locations, that from the locations where folks don't speak English as a first language, for example, and if the organization uses English as its primary language, maybe you're noticing you're not hearing from the folks who don't speak English as a first language as frequently, right? So you sort of see a pattern. If you can assume good intention, which I think is always a good thing to do if we can, then you can think about how you interrupt. And I said earlier, this shouldn't look like you just run around taking people out at the knees, right? Like being confrontive in a way that's not helpful or that sort of shames people, right? So what I find is that you can often interrupt in very subtle ways. There's a colleague of mine, a biracial woman who we do a lot of work with clients, and we noticed that it was not too uncommon that we would go to see a client together, that the client would often, and I think unconsciously and unintentionally most of the time, focus on me, assume that I was the lead person, tend to give me more of the eye contact, tend to ask me more of the questions, right? And this was a dynamic I didn't see for a while, but my colleague and I had a lot of conversations over the years, and I realized I need to own this situation. I don't want my colleague to have to walk into situations and try to manage this dynamic by herself. I needed to own it because it was important to both of us. And so often I didn't need to do anything beyond just maybe start to shift my eyes to my colleague if the client just looked at me, right? That's all I had to do. Sometimes that was enough. It interrupted the dynamic and it brought us both equally into the conversation. Or maybe if I was getting all the questions, all I had to do was say, well, actually, I'll make up a name here. Joan knows more about this than I do. Why don't you ask her, right? And if I could interrupt in that way that was subtle, then I could change the whole dynamic in the meeting. And it didn't require a sort of a riskier direct confrontation, so to speak, right? So think about how you can interrupt in the most subtle ways possible. What you don't want to do is put the outsider on the spot, right? When you're in the insider group and you want to be interrupting more, you want to do that with your observation, right? If you need to be more direct, like I'm noticing we're only hearing from folks in New York right now. Like, I'm curious what the folks in Hong Kong or what the folks in Manila are thinking about this, right? So let's be quiet in New York for a while and hear from our colleagues. You don't want your colleagues to have to do that. You want to do it when you're in the insider group. So last bullet point here, expect and ask to be interrupted. If you can find ways to model inclusive behavior by turning the spotlight on yourself, you're going to find that people are going to respond in a much more positive way. If most of what you do is just calling out other people, then you're not going to get sort of a shared sense of ownership on the team for creating inclusive dynamics. So be transparent about the fact that you're a work in progress, that you want to learn, and then use yourself as an example. Where can you do better? How can you use situations where you haven't been as inclusive as you could be as a way to pull other people in and make this something that everyone can own? So here are some behavioral indicators of an ownership mindset. And these are broad. You want to have broad engagement in DE&I work. When we start to work with a client, I like to look at, who's involved in the work, who's involved in conversations about DEI. If there are employee affinity groups, who's in those groups? If you have a women's group, you want men to be involved in that group. If you've got an LGBT network, you want to have some straight and some cisgender people involved in that network, right? Because it's through those partnerships where shared ownership develops. And that's really what pushes an initiative forward and helps embed inclusion in the organization. So I'm looking at that. I'm looking at how non-inclusive behavior gets interrupted. Are we paying attention to the inside or outsider dynamics on our team and trying to find ways to reduce their impact? So you can see in this ownership mindset, there's a sort of level of consciousness and awareness that translates into behavior that can free up folks on the team to participate more. That's why diverse teams can be more creative and more innovative, because there's more room for people to bring their full contribution. Everyone's got everyone's back in terms of creating that kind of environment. So you want to see regular discussions of DEI. Culture of ownership requires that you have, sometimes even planned regular conversations. And some of the organizations that have made a lot of progress on embedding safety into their culture, they start every meeting with a quick conversation about safety. In organizations that are really trying to dig in around DE&I and really embed it into their culture, it may mean that for a year, every meeting you have some sort of focus or topic, even if it's for 5 minutes, that's DEI related, so that people get used to talking about this stuff on a regular basis. Okay, so that's a lot of information in a fairly short period of time. I'm hoping that it's helpful to you, and I'm hoping that you're able to apply some of this information. If you need more, earlier Norma Jean mentioned the book, The Inclusion Dividend. Culture of ownership is one of the 5 competencies that we talk about in the Inclusion Dividend. We also go much deeper. I know I did a quick dip into insider and outsider dynamics. It's a really powerful concept, and we go into that concept in the book if you're interested in that. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Mark, this was just, chock full for everybody out there, just of so much information. So just know, if you joined late or if you're just feeling like, wow, I learned so much, you can watch the replay. We'll have it up here on our channel here at Podbean and on our LinkedIn and on the Dagoba Group's channels as well. So feel free to watch the replay as well. And this was just such a rich conversation, Mark. And we're so grateful to work with the Dagoba Group because, like I was saying, a lot of the technology that Podbean offers enterprise level organizations is to implement these initiatives with secure podcasting, with a secure mobile app, that kind of thing. So, when you're having these conversations around DEI and when you're talking about creating this culture of inclusivity, a lot of those conversations, what we found with our clients, is happening on podcasts. And so we're like, okay, we got to talk to Mark. We got to talk to the Dagoba Group and have you guys share your expertise and knowledge in this space. So we are so grateful to speak with you and to have you join us today here speaking about the Inclusion Dividend and the work that the Dagoba Group does. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm going to read our brief outro and then we'll wrap up today. We are here in the chat. So if you do have any questions, pop them in, and Mark and our team here at Podbean will address them and make sure that all of your questions are answered. Additionally, the link for the Dagoba Group to get in contact and the Inclusion Dividend are here in the description of our conversation today, as well as the link to Podbean's enterprise platform as well, if you have any questions about that or how DEI is being implemented with a lot of enterprise level organizations through podcasting, which is so cool. I'm going to read our brief outro and then we'll wrap up today. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone, and welcome back. Thank you. And thank you for joining us for our Corporate Podcasting Smarter February live event, Creating a Culture of Ownership, Achieving Your Inclusion Dividend with Mark Kaplan of the Dagoba Group and co-author of the Inclusion Dividend book. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, Podcasting Smarter and Corporate Podcasting Smarter has live stream sessions like this one with top podcasting and business professionals. We also have exclusive recorded episodes on the Podcasting Smarter podcast. If you joined late or want to have another listen to this conversation, you can replay this live stream on Podbean's YouTube channel and the Podcasting Smarter podcast. Corporate Podcasting Smarter is brought to you by Podbean. We're a private podcast hosting solution for Fortune 100 companies with secure encrypted podcasting and a proven track record within the industry. Head over to podbean.com/enterprise to learn more about our business and enterprise solutions. And thank you so much for joining us. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks for joining us for this replay of our live event episode. If you have any questions about podcasting and want to get in touch with the Podbean team, reach out to us at podcastingsmarter@podbean.com. Happy podcasting!